Welcome to the Actionable Futurist podcast, a show all about the near-term future with practical and actionable advice from a range of global experts to help you stay ahead of the curve. Every episode answers the question, what's the future of? With voices and opinions that need to be heard. Your host is international keynote speaker and actionable futurist Andrew Grill.
Our guest today is Thomas Bedenk, Vice President of Extended Reality for Endava. Thomas has over 25 years of experience in digital productions, focusing on strategy, extended reality and user experience to support digital transformation across various industries. Past extended reality projects he's led range from product design and training to marketing applications for internationally known brands. Importantly, his love for digital creation started when he was playing Pac-Man against his twin brother on the Atari 800 XL, leading Thomas to develop his first video game in 1996. Welcome, Thomas.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
Now, you're a bit of a pioneer in this space, given you developed your first game in 1996. What was that first game, and how did you turn it into a career?
So it was actually a couple of games, like this classical game of tic-tac-toe and Mastermind, and a couple of these games that I just did digital versions of. And then the first more unique game that I did was probably a year later. And it was called The Line, and you would use the left or the right mouse button to steer a line through a labyrinth without hitting certain obstacles and things like that. And interestingly, because all those freeware archives back in those days online, they copied from each other. I think it was downloaded like 200,000 times, which is a pretty high number for back then, even higher than some of the games I made later and tried to sell.
So going from games into augmented and extended reality, what was the path to get there?
Well, I did freelancing, doing websites, designing, corporate identity and things like that over a lot of years during school and then studying. The two subjects I studied was first media design. I had to have a degree in that. And then later on, human factors, which is a mix of psychology and engineering. That brought me already to the topics of VR and AR, because that was, of course, a major new way to create an interface between humans and machines. But at that point, I didn't do it professionally. It was only after I ended my own game studio that I had for 7 years. And that was around 2015, where I focused completely on VR and AR and did presentations and talks at various conferences, and then also met Frank Zahn, who had this Berlin agency Exocet, where we built up like a whole team and a section of the company to focus on this specifically. And then in 2019, we joined Endava.
So many of our listeners would have heard of or even used AR or VR, but you're involved in extended reality, XR. So what is this and how might it be used in a corporate environment with your clients?
XR is basically just an umbrella term to take into account augmented reality, virtual reality, immersive real-time experiences. And so it's a shorthand to not always say VR, AR, 3D, real time. That can be used in so many different ways. I tend to think of XR, at least in the near future, as being a horizontal technology like mobile or computers. So it will be applicable across industries, from entertainment to training to marketing and production design. And it's already applied in all those areas. It's just a matter of how fast will be adopted. And of course, understanding the advantages and the differences between what is augmented reality, what use cases is it there for, what is VR, what are virtual spaces, what's the difference between perceiving a three-dimensional room in 2D through a desktop and actually in virtual reality with stereoscopic vision and a true interactive interface.
You mentioned an interesting point. You've studied the role of the interface between the technology and the human. One thing I talk about is that issue of the friction. So, Google had Google Glasses and they kind of got it right. I was expecting a few weeks ago maybe Apple would come out with the device. They haven't just yet. The bulky Oculus headsets, I think, again, are some friction. And so that is getting in the way of adoption. But who's getting augmented and virtual reality and extended reality right at the moment? And what do we need? Am I right about this friction point? Do we need to remove that to sort of get ready for the technology to catch up to how humans perceive space?
I think of it twofold when you talk about user experience. On the one hand, it still seems to be a bit bulky in the way like you describe. That has changed massively already in the last 5 years. Like putting up an Oculus Quest 2 or a Meta Quest 2 is really simple, and playing a bit of bowling. My parents can absolutely do that without any problem. Of course, wearing it all day is still a different question. And then again, the perceived user experience while you are in VR. And that can be extremely more natural, more intuitive than any other interface that we're using, because the interface is almost disappearing completely in AR and VR if it's done right. And therefore, it's a bit of a paradox to be in the way and at the same time out of the way. And I think that's how you have to think about it going forward, because even this generation that's coming out this fall will be probably half the weight what we had before, at least less bulky.
So what's the biggest challenge or opportunity you're seeing in the XR space, and what should businesses be doing to prepare for this?
First of all, I think it's a level of understanding. In my intro, and I realize I still have it in my short CV there, you mentioned digital transformation at Endava, but also I think it makes sense we talk a bit more about acceleration rather than transformation, because you talked with Helena about this before in one of your episodes. And it does make sense because we don't start from scratch anymore. Every company has some kind of digital footprint. Looking at it for XR in the same way, you need to find an access, you need to find an understanding for this technology and how it will either disrupt your business eventually and when that will happen, or how can it help you today to be more efficient to solve challenges that you actually have, or engage with users that you usually can't in reach by having a new platform to interact with them.
Now, we can't talk about augmented, virtual or extended reality without talking about the metaverse, the M word. It seems to be something that no one stops talking about. I mentioned before we came on air, I'm speaking about recruitment in the metaverse, so I'm using this podcast as some homework. What's your definition of the metaverse?
Right now, I think the term is used very much in a narrative way. Everyone shapes it the way they need it to deliver the message. And sometimes that makes Snap or other organizations kind of position against each other with those different narratives, which I don't think is the essence of what we're looking at. My definition would be some kind of spatial version of the internet that is interoperable and connects different worlds and different experiences that you can experience in a more direct way with the interface stepping back from it, kind of like almost like I already described before. When you go into the details, what foundational technologies do you know? You can have a lot of discussions. Is VR necessary? Is decentralization necessary, or is it not part of this? Is crypto necessary? Are NFTs necessary? I think a lot of those technologies might be a part of it. Some are essential technologies in the background to make it work, like AI and machine learning, which isn't always apparent, but is absolute necessity to make this technology work. Some questions are more open. Will it be decentralized or centralized? I don't think there is a clear answer to those things yet.
Well, I've been doing a lot of research because when I speak to my audience, I want to take them back to first principles. And in fact, I realize, and maybe you can correct me, the first mention of the phrase metaverse was in the 1992 book Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson. We also see a glimpse of this new world in the 2018 Steven Spielberg movie Ready Player One. Everything I read about the true metaverse says it'll be interoperable, and we benefit from this, for example, in mobile phones. You're in Germany, I'm in London. If I was to go to Germany, my phone would work because it's interoperable. And I suppose the other question is, if we're talking about Web3, where you can read, write and own things, we do talk about decentralization. But I think at the end of the day, there has to be some level of centralization, some level of standardization, otherwise it won't work. You mentioned Snap, and we've got Facebook. Facebook changed their name to Meta, so people will think about the metaverse maybe. There's so much misinformation, and in fact, Sam Gilbert from Cambridge University, he argues that the metaverse isn't actually here yet. He defines the metaverse, and I'll quote him, "Fully realize the metaverse is a combination of several technological innovations that all operate seamlessly together. Some of these technologies include blockchain, cryptocurrency, NFTs, virtual reality, augmented reality, and mixed reality." And also, a friend of mine, James Watley, stood on stage recently at a Beamer conference and said that anyone who stands on stage and says the metaverse is the future hasn't got a clue. So there's some really strong views out there. Clearly, you want it to succeed because that's what you do for a living. How can we actually educate the broader community about the benefits of the metaverse and sort of stop this misinformation so it's not one against the other? If we had this discussion years ago about Wi-Fi, why would you want to be able to move your computer around the room? That's crazy. My job as a futurist is to be on top of these trends. How can we help set the world and make it ready for the metaverse?
You mentioned, is the metaverse there or is it not there? And we did an online survey leading into some of my talks, and some of my friends did. And almost every one of those surveys has a different result. But it's always different shares of people claiming it's there or it's not there. The fault behind this is it's too simplistic, this question, without having a definition of what the metaverse is and a common understanding. And like I said, all those different narratives of how this term is being used to gain in the current economy and environment. So I think that makes the discussion a bit tricky and, like you called it, misinformation. And I think that's why I mentioned earlier, the first step you need to do is like have someone in your organization understand this on a level where they can actually distinct between these different terms and understand what their the different benefits are. For example, if a company in the fashion industry introduces NFTs, they also need to understand what's the audience. Is that the audience I want to reach? Or when you gamify something like that, or even make a game out of it, are the crypto investors gamers or are they investors? So it's also understanding the different target audiences and then used a multifaceted approach to explore those different technologies and how they might help you gain from this environment. It sounds a bit general as my answer, but I think you really need to do that homework and understand it better than just throw a couple of buzzwords in the room. You mentioned the metaverse not being the future. So I would argue absolutely will be the future, and I have no doubt about it. So it's less about me wanting it to be the future. It's more like, how are we going to shape it? And who's going to be the one shaping it and be part of it? And in what direction do we push it? I think those are the more important questions. And of course, the timeline of it. And no one can give you clear answers, but there is definitely a clear vision that this will happen. Another thought to what you mentioned is Neil Stephenson metaverse and the Ready Player One metaverse. And I think there's a huge distinction you can make between those two. And you can see it, one being from the 90s and one more recently. What Stephenson said himself, he got wrong, is that he didn't think about gaming as the foundation of the metaverse. He thought it's more like TV, basically, because that was apparently the most important media at that time. That has drastically changed. And when Ready Player One was written, you could already absolutely see that essential impact of gaming. So supercomputers and all the engineering power, a lot of innovation coming from the games industry, because it is almost a necessity to do this to really convince and bring gaming and entertainment on a new level, more than it is any other industry. At the same time, it is at scale. The games industry is gigantic. And that's why this mix of this advanced technology and understanding what entertainment and what people want is a great foundation to push forward the metaverse. And that's why you see game engines, you see companies like Unreal and Unity being at the forefront of this. Even though the metaverse term was coined in the book, it was not necessarily what the metaverse will be like and what we understand today.
So it's interesting that you mentioned that gaming is a sort of entry point. And I agree with you that the whole concept of being in another world and talking to other people, it has its roots in gaming. Now, you work for a corporate organisation that does digital acceleration, as you say. So let's look at those corporate applications and where we might move from gaming, gamification. We've survived 2 years of Zoom calls sitting behind a screen, and now I see Meta and others working with conferencing companies on virtual workplaces. Is that the future, or is that just, again, too simplistic?
I think it is part of the future. I think this is one of the biggest challenges almost every organization, starting at some size, I would say, is facing currently. Like, how does the hybrid work environment work right now? How will it work in the future? What digital methods will help you in what scenario? And that's, by the way, also a very interesting analogy of how to look at the metaverse through a 2D view. It's a bit like playing a game on a 2D screen. It's a bit like having a Zoom call. You're not really in that space. You're not really spatially relating to the other people. You don't have the context. And that is such an important aspect of human communication, not only to see body language, but also relate spatially in the same context. And that's why I think it will be an essential part. If it's like coming together in a virtual office just to do a coding session for 3 hours and just throwing over a couple words and actually realizing, okay, he's speaking to me from the left side. And if I take a look up, I see his monitor, even though we're not at the same real space. I think these things will absolutely happen, and they will facilitate working together remotely on a global scale, because also hiring people has changed completely from 3 years ago. Organizations are much more open to hire remotely and globally. And still, there are a lot of challenges to solve. Cultural match, understanding each other, even being in a conversation, and already with this limited scope of a Zoom call, kind of, or on top of that, having that cultural difference of speaking more direct, really a lot of stuff going into this. And that's why I think it will be a puzzle piece, but it will not be the only solution. I'm a big proponent of understanding media for the individual advantages and disadvantages, and how they, like the classical book, Medium is the Message from Marshall McLuhan. I think there's a lot of truth to that. Every medium shapes its perception and the way it works by the capabilities it has and the limitations it has. And that's why I think it will be a very essential puzzle piece, but there are quite a few challenges still to be solved.
We mentioned the challenges, and I said in my intro the notion of the friction. At the moment, we're wearing headsets, and there is an interface. Just as at the moment I have to talk into a microphone, I'm wearing headphones, so that, we get used to that. You're at the forefront of this, so what can we see in the next, say, 12, 24 months? Where will the technology go? Obviously, things will get lighter. As a futurist, I've always thought, I don't wear contact lenses or glasses, but I've always thought if I could just literally put a contact lens onto my eye and the substrate could be so thin that I could be watching a heads-up display. Is that where things are going? Is there something in terms of the spatial awareness that we haven't seen yet?
That's why I think it's always important to somehow include this time frame that we're talking about. So when you talk about these kind of contact lenses that really give you the full experience, I think we're talking 20 years off. We're not talking 24 months off. If we're talking about making it lighter, what's the next generation of devices will bring, that's a whole different story. And I think we will already see quite a big change in all of the next gen Pro devices, introducing face tracking and eye tracking into the headsets as a standard. We've already seen that in devices like the Vario XR. They're like 5 to 10K expensive, that's almost like only for certain use cases when you need the best quality possible. But now with this low-end but professional devices coming in, there will be definitely over $1,000. You will get all this facial tracking. And I think this will make a difference for this kind of interviewing, like you mentioned, like hiring people, but also how we communicate through this. I still think that the key aspects to successful virtual reality are presence, agency, and social. This social component already works with abstract avatars a lot more convincing than a lot of the people think that haven't used it. So already seeing the body language is doing a lot to help communication. If you've seen from Meta the codec avatars and how realistic they look, even though the problem is if you're wearing a headset, you can't really film yourself while wearing a headset in a normal way. So we capture all those different aspects of your face and then reconstruct how you will look. And this is already at a really fascinating level. I see something like that definitely being in the time frame of 24 months.
You mentioned presence, agency, and social. I think I understand the first and the last one. Just run me through what the agency component is.
So agency means that you do have an influence on what's happening there. Interactivity doesn't necessarily imply that. So if you look at a hierarchical website interface, you can click through information, you can make your choice, and you can say, I want this and not that. But you're not changing anything there. When you talk about agency, I think you can still decide between local and global agency there. So are you able to have an impact on your environment and, let's say, influence what's happening there? To some extent, it happens in video games. Some video games are very linear without you noticing necessarily. And that would be more of the local agency. So you're like shooting a target to the left and then you get a point, but really the story progresses normally. And then if you have more global agency, that means you have more of a true impact of what's happening. And if you want to transfer something like that to the business world, it's like how you're using this. If you, as a team of designers, shape the new generation of your car by collaboratively designing in a three-dimensional world and simultaneously influencing, like someone drawing the inside dashboard while someone else is taking perspective from the outside and it's coming together at the same time. That's completely different than how the cars used to be designed in the past.
Endava's strapline is, we are reimagining the relationship between people and technology, which sounds like it's perfectly written for what you're doing. Can you provide me with some examples of where you're helping clients in this area and what Endava is offering in the XR space?
That phrase also applies to, making a better banking app. Of course, it also lends itself very well to what we're doing in the XR space. And I think that will definitely be more in the terms of a relationship between technology and people. And I think that's why it's important to understand people and technology to then make a good connection and understand how is technology actually helping people in solving their problems. Training is a big topic. Because if you look at virtual reality, Jeremy Bellinson is always a good source. He coined this abbreviation DICE. Each letter stands for a word that makes VR powerful. Either if something is dangerous, it's impossible, counterintuitive, expensive. That's where these virtual technologies can help you the best. So if you look at this, it will also lead you to a lot of scenarios. In training, for example, shutting down a gas turbine just to train someone to replace the tiles inside of it is much more expensive than developing training where you can have a similar direct experience of how to do this. Or pre-train again because your original training is so long ago. And now you actually have to do those operations on a real gas turbine and therefore train this. Those are two examples. More recently, for example, for Kolnage, one of the oldest art traders in the world, we recreated a painting they're selling in a virtual environment. But you have all kinds of superpowers like X-ray, and you can zoom in super high detail. You have experts telling you about it. And so it's much more reaching different target groups or people that can come to your real art gallery when it's exhibited and therefore targeting new potential buyers.
I love the DICE analogy from Jeremy that almost allows you to say, is this something that could be put in the metaverse? I remember a few years ago, everyone was talking about everything on the blockchain. There was even a Google Chrome extension which added the word on the blockchain to every sentence just as a bit of fun. Looking at that analogy, are there things that really shouldn't be in the metaverse, but people are going, oh, we're going to be in the metaverse, we're going to do this? Can we give our listeners a steer to say, you're wasting your time if you've got this scenario, it doesn't really lend itself in the metaverse?
I would first want to say that experimentation in this space is not the worst thing you could do right now. So even if it's not the best approach, you're still learning a lot from it. And you're learning a lot about how your business might change in the future. There will be virtual fashion, there will be virtual economy. And people think, like, why would I want to buy a virtual sneaker? Why do you need that? I can't wear it. But yes, you will be able to wear it in the metaverse. That's one thing. On the other hand, the people that are buying it now or people that are collecting sneakers in the real world, they're not buying them to wear them either. It's not as abstract as you might think at first. So there will be virtual economies for sure. Is it really that digital scarcity that we're trying to create right now through NFTs and crypto? Is that the economy we're facing, or is it not? Is it more like a model similar to Spotify with flat rates and abundancy? Is it something where IP is being used cross and you benefiting from it, even though you you somehow still have to protect your IP? Is it user created content? So there's just this whole complexity of things that might change based on this. And if you look at Fortnite, it already makes more money with digital clothing, basically, than some of the biggest fashion brands. So it's not just a question of the future, but it's already there. However, there are a couple of things where I think, okay, is this really the best approach looking at it from the outside? And I'm wondering, like I mentioned before, with the different target groups you have, just because someone wants to invest in your virtual sneakers doesn't necessarily make you benefit as a business from it. On the other hand, if you make it a business model, like Nike made millions with selling those NFTs, there are other questions coming up about the environmental footprint you have, and you shouldn't ignore those things when you do your experimentations, because in the end, it's still potentially affecting your brand more than the couple millions made selling those NFTs. So there are a lot of angles to consider when you do this, but I would always encourage to try out things with the metaverse.
I just want to touch on those IP issues because I'm sure there are a plethora, and you're right, we could talk about NFTs and crypto for a whole other podcast. A good example I saw was the Meta Birkin. Someone actually set up a virtual Birkin bag which sold for more than a real Birkin, and the Birkin company got a bit annoyed about that. They probably hadn't thought people were going to launch virtual copies of their goods. What are the sort of IP issues that brands should be considering at the moment, virtually as well as in the real world?
I'm going to derail your question a bit. I'm sorry, but I'll do it anyway, because I had such an interesting discussion with VP Cognitive Computing. So if you look at all those AI models creating art right now, and they're sourcing a big pool of images that are out there, but also IP at the same time. So if you prompt this thing to say, make a Ferrari looking car for me, am I infringing on copyright or am I not? Should I say, make a sports car? And who will know how I prompted this AI generated art? If you take that into the equation and the challenges of, is this copyrightable? Is this even my IP, or is this inspired by my IP? It becomes really, really convoluted and tricky. Also, I don't think these legal things have been figured out yet. There will be courts deciding either way in different countries, and definitely a tricky topic to be facing. I don't think the super protective way will lead you into the future, because there will be so much to gain from collaborating in the space and having your users actually interact with your brand and be creative with your brand. I think there's so much more to gain than to lose. But again, if legal comes in, it might not be so easy to go that route.
That's a whole other topic of the legal issues in the metaverse. I'm just thinking aloud that intellectual property may become inspired property. And we need to think about a whole new concept of how you actually own that, or maybe you're renting. Maybe we're going to rent IP. You can use it for a while and you can give it back. Maybe look at 3 things that brands should be doing now. So one clearly is education, experimentation. What else should they be doing to get ready for this next wave, this next world?
It is that experimentation and trying to actually figure out what those different technologies mean and what they are and what's shaping right now, and try to have a bit of a look into what's coming on the horizon. At the other end, you have to look at your current organization and really look at it from an angle. What challenges that I currently face can it actually solve? And really think not in all dimensions at the same time, but pick a couple of those dimensions or technologies and see where are the most helpful for me at the current moment to solve a problem. And then also look at how might this, in a much wider and broader scale, influence my business model, and how will I have to act now in order to get ready for that future? If you follow those thoughts, then first immediate thing would be to do something with it, but not just to do something with it, but identify a case where it does make sense, but then don't be afraid of experimenting with it, and then take step by step and build on that, and try to not have it go into a direction where it's just a loose end, where you can't gain from it. Something that's often overlooked, though, is all the experience and all the knowledge you gain, even in failed projects or projects that don't instantly increase your revenue. Like, I think there's a lot to be gained from experimenting and understanding what's coming in the future.
We're up to my favourite part of the show, though, the quickfire round. We will learn a bit more about you, so I'm going to throw some questions at you. iPhone or Android?
iPad and Android phone.
Window or aisle?
For long flights, aisle. Short flights, window.
What's the app you use most on your phone?
Probably the browser and LinkedIn.
What's one thing you won't be doing again post-pandemic?
Go to the office every single day.
What's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Appreciate those special moments with your family.
What are you reading at the moment?
Still catching up on the Metaverse by Matthew Ball.
Who should I invite next onto the podcast?
I mentioned him before, Radu, or from our organization. He is really a bright mind and completely understands machine learning.
Final quickfire question. How do you want to be remembered?
If I can spark some joy in my friends and family's life, that's definitely something to remember.
What 3 actionable things should our audience do today when it comes to better understanding the opportunities for extended reality and the metaverse?
Buy a VR headset. Try out even a game like golf together with your colleague overseas, and understand what the social interaction feels like in that space. And that will already lead you to a lot of ideas for your own organization.
Thomas, how can people find out more about you and your work?
Best way is probably go to my LinkedIn.
Fascinating discussion, Thomas. Thank you so much for your time today, and we'll see you in the metaverse.
Thanks, Andrew. It was a great discussion.
Thank you for listening to the Actionable Futurist podcast. You can find all of our previous shows at actionablefuturist.com. And if you like what you've heard on the show, please consider subscribing via your favourite podcast app so you never miss an episode. You can find out more about Andrew and how he helps corporates navigate a disruptive digital world with keynote speeches and C-suite workshops delivered in person or virtually at actionablefuturist.com. Until next time, this has been the Actionable Futurist Podcast.